What's up guys, it's Amanda, and today I am coming to you from my floor. Why? Because we're filming on location today. You guys said you wanted to see a printer review video, and my printer just happens to be on the floor, so that's why we're here. Today I'm going to be talking about my big honkin' Epson printer. We're not going to be talking about this one. This one's not as important. It's just a dinky HP printer that I use for like school stuff. We're gonna be talking about this bad boy, and I'm gonna kind of be going over my thoughts on it, kind of how the setup process was, how I've liked using it thus far, and just some kind of tips and tricks on how to start printing from home if that's something that you are interested in. You don't necessarily need to own this printer to take these tips into account for yourself. It just might be helpful advice for you if you're looking to stop using printer. It just might be a helpful video for those of you who are looking to move from third-party printing services into printing yourself. That being said, I am not a tech expert. I am not a printing expert. I am still very new to this, and this printer and I are still getting acquainted by the day. So this is just my opinion and my thoughts on it so far. I have had this printer for several months, and we have had a lot of learning experiences together. I printed all of my prints for Crunchyroll Expo on this printer, and that gave me a lot of knowledge in a very little amount of time. So without further ado, let's get into my printer setup, and I'll kind of break down the logistics for you guys price-wise, and then I'll go into more of the behind-the-scenes technical stuff and the supplies that I use. Okay, so currently I have my Epson printer sitting on the bottom shelf of this 5-shelf unit from Walmart. It's not a very sturdy one, which is why I had to put the printer on the bottom, because this thing is heavy. It is big and it is heavy. It measures about 24 inches wide by 13 inches deep, and I'm lucky that it even fits on this shelf, and it actually fits pretty snug, which is great. But if you are storing this, you are either going to need a very heavy, sturdy shelf, or you're going to need it to set it up somewhere close to the ground so that you don't risk damaging your furniture or your printer. So like I don't even think I told you guys what the printer is. This is the Epson Artisan 1430 wide format printer. I purchased this printer on Amazon a couple of months ago and paid about $300 for it. I know that seems like a lot, you guys, but a good quality printer is going to cost you at least a couple $100s. I know that there's a couple of good ones out there from Canon. I'm sure HP has some good ones as well. This is just the one that I was most interested in based on the reviews that I saw of it, and I did do a lot of research before buying, which I always recommend doing. I will link the Amazon listing for this printer down below. I believe right now the price has gone up a little bit, but if you have a Prime membership, you can save a lot of money. These are just little pieces of cardboard that I have taped in here so that the top of the printer doesn't come all the way down when I close it. And that's because I have a continuous ink system running through this printer, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But basically it has this extra component here that kind of bumps against the top. So I have these here just to kind of help lift the top a little bit. And it's mostly just so it doesn't make a noise when it's printing, like it's not as annoying. It's not like damaging to the printer to have this in there or anything like that. And that's another thing that I did a lot of research on beforehand, which I highly recommend doing. So basically a continuous ink system is a sort of external element that you add onto your printer to replace the need for individual cartridges. So you can see there's these individual cartridge looking things in here, but they're all kind of lumped together as one component, and it comes with like the little chips so that the printer thinks that they're individual cartridges, but then it has these little tubes running to the ink cartridges through this area down here and down into these external ink wells, which are not only cheaper than Epson ink, but just cheaper in general. It's gonna save you a lot of money, guys. I highly recommend a continuous ink system. You can do a lot of research on them. Just make sure that you find one that is compatible with your printer. Again, I will link the one that I purchased down below. I don't think it's currently available on Amazon, but I'm sure it'll be back in stock soon at some point. Basically, you just wanna make sure it is compatible with your printer. That's the most important thing. I also purchased some continuous ink system refills back here. I have not needed to use these yet because I still have so much ink in here, and I've printed hundreds of prints on here, you guys. It's so much cheaper than having to replace the ink every time you run out. I cannot say how important it is for me to have this continuous ink system, and the continuous ink system cost me like an additional 50 bucks. Totally worth it, considering one or two of the cartridge refills is gonna cost me 50 bucks. So to me, it's way worth it. Let's just quickly go over the buttons here. Let me move you in closer. Just to kind of quickly run through the buttons on this Epson printer. There's not many. This is a wireless printer, so you have the Wi-Fi light that indicates it is connected to your wireless connection. You have the power button, and as long as the power button and the Wi-Fi button are both green and solid, you're good to go. These two buttons, the Wi-Fi button and this little information button, are really only for setup. I never use those otherwise. Then we have the paper button and the ink button. So these two lights come on pretty often with this printer. Sometimes it's really finicky about the paper, and it will sort of run the paper through without printing anything several times, and you kind of have to keep hitting this button. This button will have a red light whenever there's like a reading error with the paper. Seriously, I just kind of keep hitting the button and like putting the paper back through, and eventually it will work, but this is kind of a picky printer, and I'll get into that more later on when we talk about paper types. And then we have the little ink error button, which will often get a red light if you have a continuous ink system, because printers sort of run on a timer, and when they believe that the ink cartridge will have been in your printer for a long enough time, it will come on even if the ink cartridge isn't empty, because it'll tell you that it's time to replace the ink cartridge. This will come on a lot, and basically all you have to do is hit this little like reset button on your continuous ink system. It's a little bit different for each one. My reset button just happens to be right here, so you would hold that down for a couple of seconds, and then turn off your printer and turn it back on, and that should go away. It was a little bit finicky to set up. One thing that you should know about having the continuous ink system is that the ink component won't click in quite the same way as the name brand inks will, so I did not think mine were connected properly. I couldn't figure out why it wasn't working. The only issue was that it wasn't pushed in all the way. I will link the video where I learned how to install this myself, so that way you can watch that and watch the same guy that I did, because that was super helpful. But yeah, just make sure these are really pushed in all the way so that the chips are connected and the printer can read that there's ink in there. That's the most important thing. These little components here are just to hold the little tube straight so that they don't get caught down in the printer and, you know, get stuck and cause problems with your printer. But I really have no problems with the continuous ink system so far. It's worked great, and I highly recommend it. The only issue is that you cannot update your printer software if you have a continuous ink system, because the updated software will make it so that the printer cannot recognize the continuous ink system. But to me personally, that's not a really big deal. If I have to eventually update my printer software, I will probably just buy a new continuous ink system so that I can continue to use it, because in the end that's still cheaper than buying Epson brand ink. So that's pretty much all I have to say about the printer setup. One thing that I did want to mention: when I purchased this printer and it came in the mail and I opened it and started to set it up, it requires a USB cord for setup, but it doesn't come with one, which is ridiculous because you're paying $300 for this freaking expensive printer that's wireless and super high-end and super cool, but you need a cord to install it, and it doesn't include the cord. It's super annoying, but I got over it. Luckily, I had a cord for my other printer that I could use, but just to kind of give you guys that warning, get yourself a little USB cord for printers, because you will need that for setup. I don't have to use it now because it is connected wirelessly, which is great, but yeah, one little complaint there to Epson for not including that, because it was really annoying. But anyway, yeah, let's move back to my desk and we can talk a little bit more about paper types. All right, now I'm not sitting on the floor anymore. This is way more comfortable. One other thing that I forgot to mention, if you do have a continuous ink system, is that your ink system and your printer have to be on the same level. So you can't have one higher or lower than the other. It's not a big deal, but if you are kind of cramped for space, then you do have to account for the extra space that the continuous ink system will take up. Again, not really a big deal. It's just sort of like, thought I would tell you, you know, because that is something that I found in my research when I was installing and also researching which one I was going to buy. Oh, and then the other thing was that I had a difficult time installing the Epson software for my printer. I had to troubleshoot by calling their customer service and sort of doing this really roundabout way of having to like manually input my IP address so that the printer could connect to my network. It was really complicated. Their customer service was great though, and I really had no problems kind of contacting them. and it was an easy fix, and now I have no problems with it. But that is just another thing that I wanted to mention. I didn't download the software off the disk drive that it came with. I downloaded it online from their site, and for some reason, I don't know, it was just like this roundabout way of like clicking the same thing and cycling back through. I don't know. I wish I had recorded it so that you guys could see more of what I mean, but it was just complicated. If you run into that problem, which maybe you won't, maybe you're more fluent in technology than I am, which could totally be the problem. It could be user error. I totally admit that. But yeah, so just another note, I did kind of have a problem with the software, but that is resolved now and it's all good. So I feel like I always have problems installing software, especially when I have to download the software online. So anyway, now let's talk about printer settings, because printer settings are vitally important, and it's still something that I'm learning about to this day and continuing to improve on. So one thing that is really important, you want to make sure whatever program that you're using to edit your images before printing them, you want to make sure you're able to convert the color profile from RGB to CMYK. CMYK is the color formatting for printers. You will see that whenever like you buy printer inks, you buy them in CMYK rather than like RGB. So that's just something to be aware of. And it does sort of alter the color profile a little bit, and that's probably the hardest part for me getting used to. The differences on my screen compared to how the image prints out can sometimes be very drastic, and I'll show you that in a minute. But that's really the most difficult thing that I've had, and I find that the type of paper that you use can also really affect how your colors turn out. So I do kind of just want to disclose that I'm still very, very new to this relationship, and I will compare the different kinds of paper that I've used to print on. But just kind of be aware that the color difference is still something that I'm working to improve. And if you have any advice on that, please let me know. But definitely make sure you always have your images in CMYK, not RGB. And you can kind of adjust the contrast a little bit as well, just to get them to your desired effect. And then you always want to make sure before you hit print and send the information to the printer to actually print it out, you want to make sure you have the right paper type selected. So if you're using regular printer paper, you want to make sure that you have that printer paper selected as the type of paper that you're printing on. If you're printing on presentation paper, make sure you have presentation paper selected. If you're printing on photo paper, whether it's matte or glossy, make sure that you select that type of paper, because that information is vital to your printer and making sure that the quality of your prints comes out as best as possible. And I always kind of recommend, like, especially if you're planning on selling any of these prints, print them at the highest quality possible and try and get the highest quality paper as well. That's just so important. As a consumer, I know that I always feel better about buying something when the quality of paper feels nice in my hands. You know, yeah, it's nice to look at, but it's nice to hold too. Like, you want a hefty paper, at least that's my preference. And paper preference does come down to a lot of different things. I will kind of talk a little bit about my experiences with paper and this specific printer. I do find that the Epson 1430 prefers thicker papers as opposed to thinner papers. I just feel like the colors are more vibrant on thicker paper, and it just comes out looking a little bit better. And I have a couple of images for comparison that I will kind of change the camera angle for when we get there. And the final thing that I want to talk about in regards to printer is printer care, like cleaning and maintenance. I find that every 50 to 100 prints or so, the sponge underneath the ink cartridges gets a little oversaturated, and what all you have to do, or at least all that I do, and I saw a video about this, so if I'm doing this horribly wrong and this is damaging my printer, go ahead and let me know. But I've done this several times and I feel like it's totally fine. But I just take cotton swabs and sort of dip them into that spongy well and soak up some of that extra ink, because what can happen is you can get sort of these smudges on the bottoms of your prints because that ink is just sort of, I don't know, messing everything up, and it's just kind of, you know, spilling out. And anyway, it can get kind of annoying. So I will cut to a clip of me doing that as well so you can kind of see what I mean. But let's compare these paper types really quick. Let me clear off some space. Okay, so the first kind of paper that I wanted to test out is just your regular old printer paper. Very thin, very floppy. So I just selected the regular paper type in my printer settings, and I did the highest quality that it would allow. but you can see just the quality of like holding it in your hand. It's very flimsy. It looks very flat. There's not a lot of dimension because it's just not a very thick textured paper. So one of the issues that you'll kind of see throughout the different paper types that I'm printing on is that everything has a lot more of a blue cast than the original. So you can see compared to the original, there's just a lot more of that heavy blue cast going on. Here it looks more of like a slate gray. Here, definitely more blue. The window is not as saturated. So it doesn't look bad, but you can see that this is where a lot of you are going to spend a lot of time, a lot of ink, and a lot of paper trying to correct this error and this difference. And again, this is still something I'm trying to work on. And part of that does come from converting it from RGB to CMYK because there is just a change in the color profile, but it is something that you will get better at over time. Already, this is surprisingly a lot better than when I first started printing my own prints, but it is just something to be aware of. So the next paper type that I wanted to show you is this presentation paper. This is from Epson. It's about as thin as regular printer paper, to be honest, and I'm not a big fan of it for that reason because it's just super thin. I don't find that it prints any better really than the regular printer paper. So if you're just wanting to print an image on some just regular old paper, just go for printer paper and don't even bother spending the extra money on this. I feel like it's a little less blue in some areas than the regular printer paper, but to be honest, they're pretty much identical. The presentation paper might be a little bit more of like a brighter white, but again, the quality to me isn't that great. Now moving on to cardstock. I like working on cardstock a lot because of how heavy it is. So when trying it out with printing my own prints, I thought I was going to like it a lot, and the truth of the matter is that I just don't. I do find that the colors look flat very much in the same way that they do when you print on just regular printer paper. There's just not a lot of color dimension, and I don't know if it's maybe just the cardstock that I'm using. Maybe it's not toothy enough, or I don't know, but I just don't particularly enjoy this. This is the Georgia Pacific brand cardstock. It's really great for those of you that are working with Copic markers. It's a really nice marker paper, but I just don't particularly enjoy it for printing. Although it is very inexpensive, so if you were in a pinch, you could totally use this. So when I went into my printer settings for this instance, I just picked regular paper, but I picked fine quality so that I could try and get the best quality possible, but you can see it's still just not great. So last we have my two types of photo paper. First we have my matte photo paper, and I will show you what I use. Right now I'm using the Office Depot Professional Matte Photo Paper. This is okay. Staples has one that is very, very similar that I've also used. The matte paper, I prefer a matte finish to my prints, I will say that, but I feel like it almost needs to be more of a satin matte, because if it's a flat matte, you still just don't get that color dimension, and it just doesn't end up looking that high quality. Although I do like how this paper feels heavier in my hands. It bends a little bit less, and it just feels a little bit nicer. So when you frame this or hang it on your wall, it is going to have a weight to it that is really, really nice. And I do feel like the darks printed a lot better on this paper, perhaps because it's a little bit thicker. So I don't know, I feel like I can just see a difference in how dark the shadows printed, especially like here under her legs. This is the cardstock, this is the photo paper, and to me just that extra bit of depth is really the reason why I choose the photo paper over just the regular cardstock. So this is probably my favorite of the prints that I made. Again, I still wish I could kind of correct for that blue just a little bit, maybe change the color temperature just a bit, just to sort of cut out some of this really kind of bright bluish color that is on this side of the piece, but everything else I'm actually pretty happy with. And last we have the Glossy Photo Paper. I am just personal preference, I do not prefer glossy prints. I feel like they look kind of cheap. I don't know, to me they're not the favorite in just my personal opinion, although the colors do look pretty phenomenal when you have a glossy paper, which is why I think the happy medium between the two is to get like a satin finish paper. Although satin finish photo paper does tend to be a little bit pricier. It can run you like double the cost of just regular photo paper. This is about 15 bucks for 50 sheets, which I don't think is too bad. and like the satin paper that I've seen from the same like generic brand is about $30 for 50 sheets. So it's really up to your personal preference if you prefer glossy or matte. I prefer matte, although I do feel like the glossy image does have the colors a little bit more accurate to the original, probably the closest of all of them, but I just prefer the finish of the matte over the glossy. But like I've said, it all comes down to personal preference. This is the original glossy and matte. Sorry, I can't really fit them all in frame. This video is a little all over the place. I apologize for that, but hopefully this kind of gives you some good ideas of what to consider when you first start making your own prints, what kind of paper to use, what settings to tweak and mess around with in your software. I use Photoshop, by the way. I don't think I mentioned that. I use an older version of Photoshop to edit all my prints and sort of clean them up and color correct a little bit. So yeah, so on my computer screen, it's important to mention, on my computer screen, the images always look closer to this. But when they print out more like this, it can just get a little confusing. So that's why it's important to kind of know what settings to mess with and how it's going to differ from your computer screen to the actual print, and sort of just how to account for that. It all comes with trial and error. Like I said, I'm still learning. This is still pretty new to me, but you guys seemed really, really interested in this video, so I wanted to share that with you. Alright guys, and that is it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed watching. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If there's something I can do better, please let me know. If you have specific questions regarding my printer, my continuous ink system, the types of paper that I use, anything like that, I will try and link as much information in the description bar down below. But do not hesitate to ask, because I love answering questions for you guys, and we can sort of have more of a conversation in the comment section down below. Also, if you have any tips for me, I'm still learning and I'm totally open to new ideas and trying new things. So if you have a printer paper that you really recommend, please let me know. Like I said, I'm really looking for more of like a satin matte photo paper, something high quality and heavy, but something hopefully not too expensive. So if you have any suggestions for me on how to tweak settings or anything like that, please direct me to resources, because I could always use them. And without further ado guys, I think that is it for today's video. I will see you guys Friday with my Artsy Fartsy Friday video for the week. Bye guys!